Today, we become legends.
With Smite 2's new system of strength and intelligence instead of physical and magical power, letting any god build any item, it can be confusing to initially jump into your favorite god from Smite 1 and not know which of these two stats, or both, that they're best with. This quick video will provide a brief explanation of which Smite 2 gods build full strength, full int, or can work hybrid, along with a quick example build to get you started with them. A quick general note here, I will be showing the gods' total ability scaling and ratios, not including basic attacks, as a guide for how much they benefit from strength versus int, and while this is useful, it's not the be-all end-all of what you should build, since basic attacks come into the equation on many characters, which of course scale at 100% strength and 20% int, so if your god uses basic attacks in any meaningful way, that's an extra reason to build strength. Also, intelligence is roughly 2.5 times more available than strength is, aka the average int item has around 2 to 2.5 times as much int as the average strength item has strength. This means that equal scalings percentage-wise does not mean equal damage output, as you will have larger numbers of int than you will of strength, roughly 2.5 times as much. So generally, you want your strength scalings to be at least 2 times your int scalings to be worth heavily investing into. Again, this is a generalization, and other factors like basic attacks, item passives, etc. will come into play, but I'll try to explain that as we go. Okay, with that out of the way though, let's jump in with our first god in Anhur. So first up is Anhur, and this is a very simple one. Anhur is an entirely strength-based god and operates almost identically to Smite 1, just sub in strength for where you would normally build physical power and you're golden. As an auto-attack carry, he of course wants attack speed, penetration, and one of either crit chance or kin size to amp up your basic attack damage. His ability scalings aren't really high enough to warrant going full strength ability damage in Smite 2 in my opinion, so sticking with a standard strength-based ADC build is the best way to go for Anhur. And of course, he's a basic attacker, so that's even more of a reason to build strength, as it contributes 100% to basic attacks rather than 20% for int. These two example builds should get you started for ADC Anhur, one for crit chance and one for kin size, keeping in mind that your starter item in Smite 2 has its own slot, meaning you effectively have 7 items in Smite 2. Next up we have Anubis, who similar to Anhur just builds entirely intelligence in Smite 2 like he did magical power in Smite 1, and there's no use building any strength on him whatsoever, as he doesn't use basic attacks in a meaningful way. His passive change makes it so stacking tons of lifesteal isn't as prioritized in Smite 2 compared to what it was in Smite 1, but he definitely still wants some in the build to help with his survivability. This example build should get you by on Anubis for mid lane in Smite 2. Next up is Ares, who does operate quite differently to his Smite 1 counterpart in terms of builds. Firstly, Ares had a passive change going into Smite 2 so that building aura items is no longer required for him. Instead, his passive gives a strength aura based on protections from items and an intelligence aura based on cooldown rate from items. So instead of auras, you just want to be building high protections and high cooldown rate, and this will not only give you both strength and int, but also nearby teammates. As might have been evident from his passive, Ares is also a hybrid god in Smite 2 that can make use of both strength and intelligence for his scalings. As far as how much of each, an equal balance seems generally the way to go with Ares. His scalings are basically equal percentage-wise, which does lend him a little bit more to building int due to the previously mentioned availability, but he also has some basic attack synergy that strength benefits a lot more than int does, so overall you're just looking for any item with other useful stats or passives, regardless of if it's strength or int based for Ares. But you should probably lean a little more on int if given the choice, and of course trying to build protections and cooldown rate to benefit from his passive and just to be tanky in general. Here's an example build to get you started on Ares in support. Okay, next up is Athena, who is another hybrid tank, but in contrast to Ares, there is a clear winner here in terms of scaling, and that's intelligence. Her ratio of 22% strength to 78% int not only favors int in raw numbers, but also favors it even more due to the availability. Athena doesn't have much basic attack synergy either beyond her reach passive, but even that scales at 125% strength to 70% int, which still favors int because of availability. If there's a specific item you really want the passive or other stats from where the strength is ancillary, you can build it, but aiming to build high strength on Athena is not useful whatsoever. She also has some protection scaling built in that boosts areas of her kit other than damage, and you will generally be building her tanky anyway, so the scalings don't matter as much, but if you do want to play her mid or jungle with a full damage build, for example, int is the way to go there, not strength. Here's an example tank build to get you started on Athena in support. Next up we have Bacchus, who much like the previous two is a tank with hybrid scaling. His ratio sits at 39% strength to 61% int, so it's definitely favoured to build int on him if you do want to amp up your damage in that way, but ancillary strength from items with other useful effects isn't terrible for him. However, Bacchus is an interesting one as he has an absolutely absurd 140% of both protections as built-in damage through his 1 and 2, so unless you're wanting to go full damage mid-Bacchus for the memes, you're definitely better off just stacking high protections on him as a tank, as that will give you just as much damage as building a damage item, but while also being tanky. Here's an example tank build to get you started for Bacchus in support. Next up is Bellona, who is a pretty simple one. She scales entirely with strength, and with her being a basic attacker as well, she also benefits much more heavily from strength for that reason. There's no use building any intelligence on Bellona. She does have some small protection scaling on her 1 that can boost her damage, but you're looking at very similar kind of builds to Smite 1 Bellona in terms of just attack speed, tank items, and maybe a kin size in there. Here's an example build to get you started on solo lane Bellona in Smite 2. Moving on though, next up is Cernunnos, who is a very interesting case as far as ADCs go. His scaling ratio is 46% strength to 54% int, but that's just for damage. He also has a lot of utility effects in his kit, mostly on his 1, that scale heavily with intelligence. So there's an extra reason there than just damage to be stacking some int in your Cernunnos builds. But he is also still a hunter and therefore benefits heavily from high strength due to the 100% contribution to basic attacks versus 20% from int. I think these two factors just about go even, and so Cernunnos is probably the closest to a true 50-50 hybrid god that Smite 2 has to offer at the moment. Buying an equal mix of both should serve well, but if you want to lean more into ability damage and utility effects like his 1's heal, proc red, or slow, then you could prioritize more int than strength, and if you want to go more traditional hunter with hard-hitting basic attacks but weaker abilities, you can prioritize strength more than int. It's really up to you with Cernunnos. For the example build, I'll provide a mixed build that has some of both, but definitely experiment with how you think Cernunnos works best in Smite 2. Next up is Chaac, who is fairly well spread in terms of being a hybrid god. In terms of pure damage, he definitely leans more towards strength with a ratio of 62% strength to 38% int in terms of ability damage, and of course will benefit a little more from strength for weaving in basic attacks between abilities. But Chaac also comes with quite a few nice utility effects that scale off of intelligence in his kit, like the protection buff on his 2 and the heal on his 3 and passive. Much like Cernunnos, I think some kind of a mix of both would be best for Chaac, but if you want to itemize specifically into more damage, then look for strength, and if you want to itemize more into survivability and utility, then go more for int, as that will scale the protections from his 2 and a lot of his heals. And of course, assuming you're playing normal solo lane Chaac, you want to prioritize tanky stats as well, but look for ancillary strength or int on those tank items, or maybe the occasional full damage item. Here's a quick starting build for solo lane Chaac to get you started. Next up is an easier one in Fenrir, who just builds entirely strength. He did get some small protection scalings on his 1 going into Smite 2, so building him tank is still absolutely viable, but in terms of damage builds, there's no use going intelligence on Fenrir. Another change he got in Smite 2 is that his brutalize can now crit, so going for some crit chance on him is probably the play now. Other than that, you're just looking for high strength, cooldown rate, and penetration. Here's an example build for Fenrir jungle to get you started. Next up we have Hades, who is a mono scaling god in Smite 2 as well, with 100% intelligence scaling for his damage. A bit like Fenrir, he also did get some protection scaling mechanics going into Smite 2, but they won't affect his damage, just his utility, like more protections gained on his ult, more healing on his 3, and more silence or fear durations on his 2 based on current protections. In terms of doing damage though, full intelligence is the way to go on Hades, as he doesn't have strong enough basic attacks to warrant going any strength whatsoever. Here's an example build for Hades solo to get you started. The first brand new Smite 2 god, Hecate, is also a pure intelligence user with no other scaling of any kind, so a traditional mage build with high intelligence, penetration, and cooldown rate is the way to go for her. Here's a quick example build to get you started on Hecate for mid lane. Next up we have Jing Wei, who is a mono scaling god as well and uses only strength. With her being an ADC, she of course has strong basic attacks which favour strength as well, so building intelligence on Jing Wei is a complete waste. She of course still wants attack speed, penetration, and usually crit chance over Kin's Blade since she has built-in crit chance on her second ability for synergy. Here's an example build for Jing Wei to get you started in ADC. Next up is Kukulkan, who also has mono scaling but with intelligence this time. He isn't a major basic attack user either, so won't benefit from strength in any major way. However, there is one exception to this rule specifically for Kukulkan, and that's Transcendence. While you won't benefit much at all from the strength conversion part of this item, it does give 900 mana when fully stacked, which itself converts into 63 intelligence from Kukulkan's passive, and another 63 intelligence with Book of Thoth's passive. Meaning on Kuku with Book of Thoth, Transcendence's total stats are 900 mana, 4 mana regen, 96 strength, and 126 intelligence, with the strength only going higher as you buy more mana items. While the only benefit of the strength is to your basic attacks, this item is pretty much worth it on its own just for the 900 mana and 126 intelligence when combined with Book of Thoth. With that in mind, here's a quick example build for Kukulkan to get you started in mid. Moving on though, we have Loki, who is once again a mono scaling god and uses only strength for his abilities. He does use basic attacks a decent bit for in-hand cancels between abilities, but since he's already building strength anyway, that's just an extra reason to build strength and no intelligence on Loki. Here's an example build to get you started for Loki jungle. From a simple mono-scaling god to the most hybrid god there currently is in Smite 2, next up is Mordred, who is hybrid in 3 different ways. He's a tank-assassin hybrid that can work well with tank builds, bruiser builds, or full damage builds. He's also a strength-int hybrid that scales well with both of these stats, and he's even somewhat of an auto-attack and ability damage hybrid, since he does have some strong reasons to go auto-attack, though I do think ability-based is the way to go on Mordred for the most part. His ratio is 61% strength to 39% int, which I think pretty accurately describes how to build him quite well. You generally want to lean more on strength, but building int items is perfectly fine if they have strong passives or other stats you want in your build. His auto attacks are even mixed scaling, with his first and fourth being more strength based and his second and third hits being more int based. The int based hits are much stronger in terms of scaling, since as we've mentioned before, 100% int scaling is way better than 100% strength scaling, but this is somewhat evened out by the fact that the first hit is strength based, and since you'll be auto attack cancelling a lot on Mordred, that first hit will represent more of your overall damage output than the other hits in his chain will. So yeah, Mordred can really do almost anything in terms of builds, so I'll provide 2 for him here. 1 tank build for solo lane and 1 full damage build for jungle. But keep in mind that you can edit these to your heart's content with Mordred, as he's extremely versatile build wise. Next up, we have Neith, who is a very hybrid god in Smite 2 as well. In terms of her ability scaling, she definitely does lean more towards int, with 62% int and 38% strength, which of course is boosted by availability, so you're definitely better off building int in terms of boosting her ability damage. She is a hunter after all though, so building a little bit of strength isn't terrible either, as it will scale her basic attacks much more than the intelligence will. At the moment though, it seems a full intelligence ability nuke build is the best way to go on Neith for the most part, but you definitely can lean more into strength if you want to and go for a more traditional ADC build. That works as well. Here's an example build for ability nuke intelligence Neith for mid or ADC. Next up, yet another hybrid god in Odin, who definitely leans more on strength with a ratio of 68% to 32%, especially since he will be auto-attacking a lot in between abilities as well. With availability considered though, he definitely has some reasons to build in, with his shield scaling very heavily with it and his 3 pulses also doing int-based damage. Here's an example tank build to get you started with Odin in solo. Next up, we have Sol, who is a pretty interesting case, as her ability scaling ratio is 86% int to 14% strength, which would make you think she leans almost solely on intelligence. But due to her being a magical ADC, she actually benefits from strength a lot more than it appears from these numbers due to the 100% scaling on auto attacks via strength. You can still go for a full int build and focus solely on ability damage, but especially if you're playing Sol in ADC, you're going to want to focus a little bit more on strength than this ratio would lead you to believe. Here's a quick example build to get you started on Sol ADC in Smite 2. Moving on though, we have a much simpler god in Susano, who doesn't have a hybrid scaling whatsoever and scales entirely with strength for his abilities, and of course his strong auto attack cancels are just another reason to build strength over int. Other than that, you're just looking at AA cancel boosts like Hydras, cooldown rate and penetration for your Susano builds. Here's a quick example build to get you started in jungle. Next up, we have yet another simple one with very similar arguments to Susano, and that's Thanatos. Entirely strength scaling on his abilities with strong AA cancels that also benefit heavily from strength. There's no reason to build any intelligence on Thanatos. Here's a quick example build for Thana jungle. Next up is the Morrigan, who is also very simple in terms of strength versus int. She has 100% int scaling on her abilities, and while she does tend to weave in an auto attack in her base kit combo, it's not worth building any strength just for that. And of course, her ultimate takes the build of the god you transformed into, so there's no reason to like build strength on her if you're transforming into strength based gods, for example. Just go full int on Morrigan and that will work just fine. Here's a quick build to get you started for Morrigan mid. Our penultimate god for the video is Ymir, who has a ratio of 16% strength to 84% int, and unless you're building full strength crit Ymir for the lols, you're definitely better off stacking int for damage if that's what you want to do. But of course, Ymir is best used as a tank, and you're only really going to be getting small amounts of int or strength in your build anyway, especially in the support role. Here's a quick example build for Ymir support. And finally, our last god for the video is Zeus, who in terms of abilities is a 100% int scaling god, but he does have some basic attack synergies in Smite 2 due to his new second ability, and Detonate not removing charges anymore, so you can continue the bonus auto attack damage after detonating for the stun. However, I think unless you're specifically going for an auto attack build, you're just better off going full intelligence ability damage on Zeus, as his scalings are so high that building into some strength for your auto attacks will just make your overall damage worse. Here's a quick example build to get you started for Zeus mid. But there you go, that's every Smite 2 god as of CA1, and whether they use strength, int, or hybrid, and an example build to get you started on each one of them. If this guide helped you out in terms of understanding the new build mechanics of Smite 2, then don't forget to drop a like before you leave and subscribe for more guides coming soon. Catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.